Everyone, I thought today we would just do some riffing and wondering on evil. I've had at least one person ask me about evil. Does it exist? What is it? What's its nature? And so I thought we would just share some ideas and share some thoughts. And I'm very interested in a conversation. If you disagree with anything that I say, be sure to mention it in the comments, because it is kind of a radical approach, and it's not my own for sure. It's collected from a lot of the Vedantic writings. The problem with evil is if you give it an existence, you have to give it a source. Where did it come from? If it's been here from the beginning, then it has to be equated with God. Either you're going to have two gods, a good God and an evil God, which then you have two eternal beings, and if you've got that going on, then neither of them is going to be omnipotent and omnipresent. If they're both omnipotent and omnipresent, then they're one and the same thing. And so that's the first problem with evil, is that if you say it actually exists in and of itself, it has to have a source. Now, if you're willing to say that God created evil, then God is responsible for evil. And it would be an odd situation to create something destructive when you are known for being unconditioned love. If you're being known for having perfect grace, and then you've created an evil thing, where did that come from? It had to exist within you for it to come out of you. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach from the Vedantic scriptures, and this idea is that evil actually does not exist. Evil is a perspective, a point of observation. And here's the case for that. We see the world through our senses, and we process those senses through the mind. And the mind, as we've talked about in the past, has two functions. It differentiates and it categorizes. Now, in the process of finding difference, difference means a relativity. How are things different from each other? If this is red and that one's not red, then you've got your difference. And if you're going to categorize it, how is it not red? Is it yellow? Is it blue? Is it green? Is it white or black? Or some combination? So in the mind, taking in this information from this world and having to arrange everything in a relative perspective. Everything is related to each other. You can only have something that can be described as tall if you have something described as short. If you just have tall things, then that's not an attribute. If there's nothing to compare it to. It has no relationship to something else. So our mind then likes to come up with the extremes. It says, okay, there's light and there's dark. Those are my two opposites, my two endpoints. So I've got my two endpoints, and I like the extreme nature of them because now I can fit everything in between in its proper relationship to absolute dark and absolute light. Okay, so the mind works in that way. So that's why we live in a world of duality. The mind has gone through and analyzed all of these differentiations and built relationships out of them and put everything in its category relationally where it belongs to the two bookending extremes. So we've got good, we've got something called evil. We've got light, we've got something called darkness. Now, I'm going to take the light and dark issue because it's easier to talk about. So think about light and darkness. Light, we know what it is. We think we know what it is anyway, this beautiful illumination that's everywhere. Interestingly enough, and as a side note, Eckhart Tolle says that light and love are equivalent, which I thought is a beautiful idea for knowing and understanding how light is everywhere. Now, you've got these two extremes. Now, when you try and define darkness, you've got a little bit more trouble. I remember, when I was very young, I was in 8th grade, and I read in Genesis, in the beginning, there was the void and darkness was upon the face of the waters. And I said to my dad, I said, gosh, that's before anything was created, and yet here's darkness existing. How can darkness exist before anything was created? And fortunately for me, my father gave me a great answer, and it stayed with me now 55 years. He said that darkness is not a thing in and of itself, it's the absence of light. So it's nothing. It's not that it's a thing, it's the absence of a thing. There's nothing. So you've got darkness described as the absence of light. Now I'm going to take that and interpolate it over to our conversation about good and evil. On the one side, we've got God, who I don't think many would argue, if you're going to be a believer in God anyway, which is not necessarily, that he is all good, which means he's love. Love absolute, unconditioned love, unconditioned existence, unconditioned intelligence. That's our description, our illegal description of God, because God actually does not have any limitations, and so either is all attributes or no attributes. But the sages say the last thing that you utter as you fall into oneness, into that one without a second, the last three words or distinctions that you can yell out loud are Satchitananda, and we talk about that quite a bit: existence, knowledge, and bliss, absolute, or if you like, being, love, and intelligence, absolute. So you've got now a situation where evil does not exist. It's merely an absence of love, an absence of intelligence, an absence of being, an absence of existence. And everything falls then in between. And you're like, no, but what about good and bad people? I think that you can describe all of the bad in the world as being the absence of love, and all of the characteristics that actually fall in an understanding of love. You have something like, I've mentioned before, within each of us, there's a gradation. The more a person is identified as being the body and the mind, they're identified with these limiting adjuncts, the body and the mind, the more they're going to tend toward selfishness, because the body is separate from everybody else, and my concern is about that body. My mind is separate from everybody else, so I'm concerned about my mind. And so if I live with the identity of being separate and apart from everything else, on the physical plane, the body from all of my peers, and on the spiritual plane, my mind, and even on the more subtle spiritual plane, the idea of an individuated soul, we're going to be separate from everyone else, and so our concerns are going to be above everybody else. So the more we're deluded into that idea of being separate from everything, the more we tend toward evil tendencies, which is not love, not intelligence, not being. That's where murder comes. It's removing the being from somebody else. Not loving, not sharing, not caring, no empathy. These are all categories of evil come out of that. So on the one end, you've got a Hitler. You look at Hitler, and Hitler had an ideal. He did. He had an ideal. Of course, it was a very limited ideal. It was based very much on a person's body, a person's nationality, origin, racial characteristics. And so his ideal was very narrow, and it benefited a handful of people. Those people that fit his description were very highly benefited from his philosophies and his ideas. They were people that believed in the same way that he did, very much so that he was a body-mind. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got our Jesuses, our Buddhas, our Chaitanyas. These are people who are spiritually identified. They're identified with that component of self which is universal. They see themselves in everyone. They know that everything in the universe is part and parcel of them, of this one, and that you can't affect any component of that one without affecting all of the others. So they have that notion of oneness. So their ideal is based on the idea of being spirit, having no division, being ultimately the owner of all attributes. And so their acts of love, their dedication to their ideal, benefits a huge number of people. Ideally, it benefits everybody. But of course, it's not going to identify those or benefit those people who are very body-mind based. I mean, there were some folks around that crucified the guy, right? So even though as Hitler had his handful of followers that were really getting a lot out of his theories and ideas, egotistically very satisfying, Jesus had a handful of people that were very much against this idea of oneness, this wideness of acceptance, this wideness of grace and love, and found their systems and their ideals challenged, and they hated him for it. So we see that evil really only exists as an absence of that oneness. It's the height of differentiation. Now, I always look at 9/11 as a great example. You know, as an American male in my 20s at the time when that happened, I think, no, it was in my 30s actually, when that happened. And to me, that was a horror. That was the definition of evil. Oh my God, look, somebody, how horrible they've done this, this terrible thing. And then on the other hand, I saw on the news that night, now whether it was real or not, I don't know, but I saw on the news that night that somewhere else in the world, there was a 20-something group of Muslim boys, Islamic boys, who were celebrating. You know, finally they had punched this imperialistic dragon in the eye. Finally they had made a mark, you know, on this relentless march of materialism. And they were celebrating. And I thought to myself, how interesting. Here's two people looking at the same event, experiencing the same event, but because of their identity, because of who they thought they were or how they think of themselves, one sees it as the greatest act of evil and horror that you can imagine, and the other is seeing it as a great act of faithfulness and victory and marvel. You know, at last the change is coming. So you can see that the event itself is neutral. The event itself happened, like a volcano blows up, a hurricane blows. You know, that things of nature we normally give easily that permission to. Things caused by intellects, caused by actions and ideals, we're not so liberal in giving that neutrality to. But for the sake of the moment, accept the fact, if you're willing, or at least contemplate the idea that even the actions of men are neutral, if you're identified with soul and spirit. You know, nobody can be killed, nobody can be harmed. That's a description of the soul from the Vedic scriptures. You know, that it cannot be burned, it cannot be wet. You know, the wind cannot blow it. Anyway, all of these different ideas. It has no gender, it has no age, it is immortal. You know, all of these things are the identity of the soul. So we live in a relative world where the values of everything, until it meets you, is neutral. Nothing that is happening is good or bad, right or wrong, you know, loving or unloving, until it meets that presence of the divine within you, until it encounters the absolute representation of love, existence, and intelligence absolute within you. Once it bounces off that wall, it suddenly has a value. It's either good or bad, right or wrong, up or down, tall or short, left or right, fat or thin, ugly or handsome, poor or rich. Once it meets you, until it meets you, it simply has an isness quality. It simply is. So think about it. There is no evil in this world. There is only God. Identify yourself with the traits and characteristics of the beloved in the truest sense. Now, we're talking not about something you can experience through mind you. This is a universal understanding. There are no words for it because it's not a point of perspective, because in that highest realization there is no individuation. You know, part of the tool that we use, the mind, not only does it differentiate and categorize, but it also imposes several things on our perspective of the world. One, it needs the object, it needs the experiencer, and then it needs the relational experience between the two. So it needs three components in order to conceive of anything, right? If a situation or a thing that, if it's, not, you can't even say a thing, if something is being looked at, for the sake of not having words to talk about this, it has to have those three components in order for your mind to be able to conceive or think about it. If there's not the object, the experiencer, and the relational distance between them, or the relational relational relationship between them, the mind can't conceive. In that highest realization, which is what we are alluding to without naming it, because it can't be named, there is not that three-part component. There is oneness, and in oneness there is no experience, because there's no subject-object relationship available for that to happen. There's one without a second. So that's why we can't really say what enlightenment is like, what the God perspective is. If you are everything, than who is hurting who is dying in the realm of immortality. But because we're identified with body and mind, we put the limitations on ourselves, the limitations of time, limitations of space, limitations of causality. And within that world, certainly there seems to be an evil. There seems to be a good. There seems to be a life, and there seems to be a death. There seems to be a birth. All of these things come into play. But the sages all say that those things are not real, that only the unchanging absolute is real. That is the pursuit, as it were, again, no words to properly talk about it, of spiritual practice, is to come to the knowledge of who you really are, what you really are, what is your nature as this thing, this experiencer, and how did the rest of it come into play. So that's a discussion on evil. Talk about it, think about it, contemplate it, and see where it goes, and share your ideas. Let's leave the judgments and nastiness out of it if we can, and just share your perspective. I think all perspectives are valid. If they're done with awareness and careful thinking and careful discernment, it has a validity. So I'm not attacking people who have a different idea, and I'm interested in hearing them.